What is up, guys? Luke here. Hope you're all doing well and that you are excited to get back into another session here in Barcelona. I'm at the casino, gonna go inside to play some PLO. First, appreciate all the kind words on my last episode. Thanks for that. And now it's time to play some live pot limit Oma. Let's get inside. Hopefully this is gonna be a good night. And yeah, let's get in and play some pot limit Oma. First hand of the session, I look down at Ace-Jack 10-5 double suited in the big blind. I raise it up, which is of course not possible. So posting the blind, player on my left laughing that I'm giving away some information straight away. There is a limper and then an ISO raise in the hijack. Guy sits on a 1,500 euro stack. I buy in for 600 euro in the beginning and a call in the cutoff for 25, and it folds back to me in the big blind, and I have a decision whether or not I want to squeeze or call. Now, an ace-high double-suited rundown with 2 additional Broadway cards is generally strong enough to come in for a squeeze. So in hindsight, I don't really love the call. I think my hand is too strong and connected. I just want to build a pot, get more money in. Especially also given that I think that my opponents are playing wider ranges. I like a squeeze more. Anyway, I make the call. I check on ace, king, 8 rainbow, which I would do with my entire range. And the initial open raiser comes in for a pot size bet of 105. Now against this large bet, I don't think I can do much really against a half pot size bet or against a 2/3 pot size bet. For example, I would probably just check call. But the sizing now in the price is too expensive for a pair and a gutter. I can easily be dominated, and also keep in mind that my opponent is betting against 3 other players. So I make a fold, and the first pot goes to my opponent, and we move on to the next hand. Next up, I look down at ace, king, king for single suited with the ace high nut suit. Beautiful hand. There's a button straddle of 10, which is very common in this game if we play 5-5. So most of the time it plays 5-5-10 actually. The big blind raises it up to 40, and I have a decision to make whether or not I want to 3-bet or just call. I think both lines are valid, especially because I have the ace-high suit. Calling is also okay, but I do believe my opponent, who was open raising, played a little bit too loose of a range and definitely is capable of raising more hands from that position than he probably should. So therefore, 3-betting I think is totally fine in this situation. So I make it 140, and we see a fold by the cutoff, and the button now decides to call. A little bit surprising when you would think and look at the stack size, because he only plays 30 big blinds basically. But this player was, I don't know, like he was playing almost any hand really. So given that, it's not really a surprise. The small blind calls and also the big blind calls. And we look down at a flop that is queen, queen, 10 rainbow. Not a great board because, I mean, I don't have a queen, but I'm also up against 3 opponents. So I need to be really selective, even though I have the overpair and the gutter. Both players check to me, and I decide to check as well. I could bet really small, but I don't think there's too much value in it. And I don't need protection also really because I have the gutter. So I like a check here, and the button very quickly goes all in for 150. He doesn't have much anymore. Now the plan for myself is to call if the other 2 players fold. But the small blind folds, and then the big blind makes the call, and therefore I decide to actually fold my hand. I think the big blind can easily have a queen or 10-10 or just slow play queen 10. Sometimes he will have another hand, but I just don't see that many calls really that aren't very strong hands. He could have a wrap, for example, but I'm blocking 2 kings, so I block king jack 9 and ace king jack, which is not great in that sense, making it more likely that my opponent actually has a queen. So I decide to fold. Very cheap price, but I do believe that overall it's probably the best play. Again, I'm not that afraid of the button, but the big blind is definitely capable of connecting here really well and therefore having a strong hand. Turn is the 7 of clubs. The button is all in, so there's no more action. The board runs out with a queen on the river, and the big blind shows up with jack 10, 9, 8 single suited,
And the button shows 10, 9, 8, 6 single suited. So I actually would have won this hand, unfortunately. The big blind did have a rep, which was basically the only non-mate hand I think that is capable of calling. And he had the rep that is actually the only rep possible that I'm not blocking, which is Jack 9, 8. Anyway, the big blind wins, and we move on to the next one. I look down at ace, ace, king, 4 triple suited with 3 diamonds. What a beautiful hand, guys. What a beautiful hand. Open raising, obviously, from under the gun, making it 35 euros. By now, we changed the stakes from 5-5 to 5-10, which actually lowers the rake that is being paid at the table. So that's good. And the stake is still pretty similar because 5-5 often ends up being 5-5-10. So all good. Raising it up, we get 3 callers actually. And we go 4-way to a flop, which comes ace 8-5 with 2 hearts and a 1 diamond. And this is of course a great flop for my hand and also for my range pretty strong because I will have a lot of ace ace in my under the gun range. Now one thing to keep in mind though is that the 2 low side cards don't connect at all to my open raising range or very little. And on top of that, the board is quite draw heavy, even though I have the backdoor diamonds. If I bet and get called, like the playability on turns and rivers is not going to be that great. I'm also out of position against 2, so if I check, there are 2 players on my left who can bet and therefore give me a chance to check raise. Now, although I think betting here is completely fine and absolutely a good option, I went for a check in order to go for that check raise. Unfortunately, both my opponents very quickly check. Now, unfortunately, the turn is the 6 of hearts. Terrible card, so I have to check again. And everyone checks around to the river, which is the deuce of spades. Now, on the deuce of spades, I don't think I can still value bet, given that there is the flush out there and also multiple straights. Now, I'm going to go ahead and check and hope to get to showdown. I don't even want to see a bet go in by anyone else, because if I see a bet, like there are so many hands that I'm behind against. The button bets 50 and now the big blind actually makes the call for 50. And it turns up that I'm making here an incorrect fold because the button wins the hand and he shows up with deuce deuce. I don't know what other 2 sidecards he was holding, but he rivered a set, decided to value bet really thin on the river, and he actually get called by a weaker hand, and I would have won. Now, is this a massive mistake? Maybe, because the price was so cheap, basically 50 in the pot. Maybe I should have called in hindsight, but on the other hand, there's 7-9, 7-4, 3-4. There are low hearts for sure out there, so maybe it's not that terrible actually. Let me know, guys, what you think. Is this a snap call on the river, or do you think that the fold on the river is totally okay? I look down at 10-10, 9-8 rainbow in this hand, and I actually remember that I misread the hand pre-flop. I thought I was holding 10-10, 9-8 single suited, and therefore decided to make the call on the button against an open raise and multiple callers. With 10-10, 9-8, I think my hand is connected enough to make the call if I have one suit. But apparently, I thought I had the suit, which I don't, and with the rainbow combination, like calling is definitely too loose, I would say. Even though we are connected, I don't love to see the hand being a call if we are rainbow. But if you flop middle set on a quite dry board, it's all good, of course. In position, very happy, of course. So let's build a pot, get some money into the middle. My 3 opponents all check to me, and I decide to bet 80 euros on the button. I think the sizing is good, going half pot, a little bit over half pot, totally fine. If the board would be more draw heavy, I think sizing up is okay as well. But on this board, I think this is a good sizing. Trying to really challenge, for example, medium strong queen X hands. So one player calls, and we see a turn that is the 4 of hearts going heads up to the turn. My opponent is not holding a big stack at this point, only 345. I'm sitting at 540. Also not a massive stack, but basically the SPR is a little bit over 1. And because that is the case, and there is now more draws on the board, I think potting here makes a lot of sense. Betting basically the maximum, and basically telling my opponent, it's up to you. Do you want to get it in? Do you want to play for everything, or are you going to make the fold on the turn? He thinks a little bit about it before eventually pushing all the chips into the middle. There he goes. I need to add a little bit more to the pot to make the call, which is, of course, what we're going to do here. And the money will go in, looking down at a river, which is the Jack of Spades. My opponent showing up with the nut straight on the river, holding Ace, King, 10, 9, turning the hard draw with his hand, and now rivering the nut straight. Unfortunately, I lose, even though I make the straight on the river as well, losing a 1,000 euro pot. Unfortunately, time to rebuy. On the turn, when the money did go in, I was looking down at 75% equity, so the money did go in really well. Unfortunately, things didn't work out. Rebuy, and let's keep going. In this hand, I look down at Jack, Jack, 10, 7, single suited on the button. This hand, I'm going to limp after a limp and a call in front of me. Now, I'm not sure how much I really like that. I think raising it up here is still the standard play. Pushing out the blinds would be a great result. And I also don't expect to get limp re-raised very often. I don't do it though. We go 5-way to a flop, which comes Ace, Jack, 8 with 2 hearts and 1 club. We flop middle set. Great, of course, and a gutter and a backdoor flush draw. So very strong hand on the flop, but we have to keep in mind that we're up against 4 other players. Now, one of the limpers bet 30 euros, and I decide in position to just call. By calling, I underwrap my hand slightly, and I also don't risk to raise and then someone else coming over the top, potentially somehow showing up with aces, which I don't think is that uncommon really, that people limp aces from, for example, under the gun. But that being said, I don't think that raising on the flop is necessarily a bad idea, especially because there are so many draws out there. Charging those draws, getting some equity denial is quite good. Still, I'm okay with the call as well. Anyway, we go heads up to a turn after the other players fold. Turn is the 6 of spade. And on the 6, my opponent checks to me, and I definitely want a value bet at this point. Trying to get value from an ace, from ace 8, for example. Charge those hard draws that are out there or the straight draws, so definitely betting here. Not that afraid of getting check raised, I must say, at this point after he checks. Still, it is possible, but if it happens, we will have to deal with it. Anyway, my opponent ends up folding, and we do take down this pot. And we move on to the next hand. I look down at Ace, King, 10, 8, single suited with 10 high hearts. And I'm on the cutoff. Now there's a limper in front of me. And the player who limped was really playing basically every hand or almost every hand. Limping, sometimes raising, getting it in pre-flop with, for example, Queen, Queen, Jack, 4, single suited. Not uncommon. All these things happened with this player, so I'm happy to play a pot in position against him, so raise it up. We see a caller as well in the blinds, and we go 3-way to a flop after the limper obviously also calls. He's not going anywhere. And the flop comes 10-4 deuce. I flop top pair and the backdoor hearts. I also have 2 overcards to the 10. The player in the blind decides to check, and also the limper checks. Now, I have a decision whether or not I want to bet. I do believe that the board is dry enough that my ace 10 is very often the best hand. And on top of that, I don't expect to get check raised very often because the board is so dry and it's unlikely my opponents will have a great hand. So I like a bet here also because the small blind overall quite passive. And the guy who was limping plays such a wide range of hands that I think I can still get value from a lot of weaker hands even by going for a bet. So I bet the player in the blind folds, and the guy who was limping, who I want to keep in, he decides to call, and we see a turn, which is the Queen of Spades. Now on the Queen, my opponent checks, and I decide to check back. I don't think ace 10 at this point is a value bet anymore, and if I bet and get called, I'm basically up against a better mate hand, which is not great, of course. So I like to keep his range as wide as possible and see a river with a hand that also plays fine going to the river. River is the ace, which is a really good card for my range and not necessarily a great card for his range because he has such a wide range of hands. I think ace 10 at this point is still a value bet, even though it feels a little bit thin. I believe that against this opponent, I am capable of value betting because he plays such a wide range of hands. And also, I do strongly believe that he would have bet ace queen or better himself on the river. So I value bet ace 10, and my opponent very quickly calls. I show down ace 10, 2 pair. My opponent shows down ace deuce. We are good, and we are winning down a nice pot against this player. Very happy with the river value bet, even though it is a little bit thin. Sometimes you have to go for it based on your read, based on what you believe your opponent is playing, and we take down a nice pot. I look down at 9-8-6-5 double suited in this hand, guys, where I open a raise to 115 after I see a limp and a call in front of me. This is a straddle pot as well, so the pot already has a lot of money in the middle before I decide to raise it up. Now, the reason I raise it up, beside the fact that my hand is double suited and connected, also is because I want to push out players behind me that have suits that are dominating me. I don't necessarily want to play a multi-way 5, 6, 7-way pot with a hand where suits become extremely vulnerable. So I make it 115, and the player on my left now 3-bets me to 420. The players in the blinds fold before the initial limper decides to call 420 as well. I would say he doesn't have aces anymore because he would push aces pre-flop in almost always. But he will definitely have a very tight and well-defined range. This player was playing overall very solid and tight. So I expect him to have like a 6% range, for example, here without aces. Basically only strong hands. Now the player on my right, who was playing extremely loose throughout the entire session, now decides to get all his money into the middle. Not that long ago, we actually stacked off pre-flop with a very marginal hand, being up against aces, losing. He was losing throughout the entire session, already rebuying a couple of times. And now I think he was just done with it and decided to just get it in. I'm very sure that this player at this point does this with a very, very wide range. So the question now is, do we want to get it in, or what do we do? Being double suited and connected, the fact that we have low cards is actually quite good, because especially the 3-better and the player who limp called, who's also holding a very tight range, are very likely holding high cards. Basically, that's good for me because that means that the outs that I have are probably more live. Now, one thing that is not necessarily that great, or I would much rather see, is that the player on my right actually was much tighter, because that would make my hand even stronger against their stack of ranges. However, of course, 9-8-6-5 double suited. If we think about it, how much equity do we have, and how well does our hand match up versus their stack of ranges? We definitely have a hand that we want to get in here. Looking at a equity breakdown, thinking about the stack of ranges in play, I can easily hit 28, 29% equity here against these ranges, so good enough to get the money in. Again, we're not too thrilled about it, of course, because we're still going to lose very often the pot, but we will have to get the money in here and see what happens, basically. So the money will go in, and we're going to play a massive pot here. Over 4,000 euro go into the middle. After counting all the chips and making sure everything is correct, more and more people show up around the table, which is fun. People notice that there's a big pot going on. People are excited, and let's see what is going to happen here after the chips are counted. Over 4,000 euro in the middle, guys, and let's see a flop. Queen 4-3 rainbow. I flop an open-ended straight draw and a backdoor flush draw. Let's see a turn, guys. The 7 of hearts, guys. The 7 of hearts. What a beautiful card. Making the straight. River is the 3 of clubs. Let's hope we hold. Let's hope we hold. No one holding a boat at this point. The player on my left showing up with ace, 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 deuce, turning the nut flush draw. Luckily, no heart on the river. So we win against this guy. And the other players that are in the pot are going to muck their hand. They're going to muck their hand, guys. And I'm taking down this pot worth over 4,000 euros with the straight. Getting it in pre-flop with 9-8-6-5 double suited, guys. Amazing, amazing. Super happy with this one. Let's go. Let's build a big stack here. Get the chips to me. There we go. Looks beautiful. This looks beautiful, guys. Super happy with this hand, of course, with the run good. And let's keep crushing, guys. Let's keep crushing. Let's go. Beautiful stack. Not that long after I won this massive pot, I'm looking down at ace king 10-8 double suited in the cutoff, and I face a limper by a relatively tight player, I would say. I played a couple of sessions so far with him, and I haven't seen him go out of line that often. Played pretty solid overall. Still, of course, my hand very straightforward. Raise to 45, and my opponent comes in for the raise to 150. Now, based on my somewhat limited live PLO experience so far, I would say almost always the limp re-raise is gonna be aces. Especially if players play a more tight style. I think this definitely holds true almost always. But even if they don't, like most of the time, it's just gonna be aces, I would say. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing something there. Maybe you guys let me know in the chat what you believe is true about the limp re-raising range in live PLO, but I think most of the time it's gonna be aces. Anyway, we're still gonna call, of course, with our connected double suited hand, and we're gonna see a flop that is 8-6-4 with 2 diamonds. We flop top pair and the second nut flush draw, and at this SPR roughly 4, my opponent is definitely not gonna bet and stack half with his entire range. At least he shouldn't, because the board simply doesn't interact to his limp raising range. He will have more often high cards, almost always aces again, and most of the time these aces will not connect with a board like this. And because the SPR is still relatively high, I see a lot of checks there for sure in theory, and I also think in reality people will do some checking here. My opponent checks, and I have a decision to make. Do I want to stab in position or not? I think there is merit to both lines, really. On the one hand, we have a medium strong hand, and if we bet and get check raised, which I believe definitely is possible, like my opponent, again, capable of checking, I think also with some good hands, and therefore check raising, putting me in a very tough spot if I would face that line, basically. On the other hand, like, if he bets too many strong hands in the first place himself, then betting becomes more interesting, and we can actually fold out some aces maybe on a board like this. Anyway, I think both lines are okay. I like a check, I think, a little bit more, also because my hand plays quite good on turns and rivers. So I check, and we see a turn which is the king of spade. King of spade, of course, a great turn for my hand, but my opponent ends up potting on the turn. He's basically wrapping at this point. A very strong mate hand could be king-king that he turned, even though it's unlikely because I block a king and because I put him on ace-ace. Almost always he should have ace-ace, king-king. Maybe he limp re-raised with a hand like ace-king-king double suited. Definitely possible, but still I'm blocking a king. But he's wrapping a very strong hand, of course, using this sizing. He could have also slow played on the flop with a strong mate hand. Now want to get some value building a pot. So therefore betting himself for full pot. So he pots, and I have a decision to make. Do I want to call or do I want to raise? And in the moment, I was a little bit unsure, absolutely. Like, I have a great hand at this point. I block some very strong mate hands, but at the same time, my opponent pots and basically is representing a very strong hand. So if we would pot hands like ace-ace with the nut flush draw and, for example, any board pair blocker, against those hands, I definitely want to get it in because I'm ahead. But if my opponent is not potting enough with hands that I'm dominating, and he's primarily potting with sets and slow played straights on the flop, then my stack off is not that great, and I rather just call and play a river in position, basically, without committing my entire stack. In game, I decided to go for a raise, which in hindsight, I'm not sure how much I like it, to be honest, guys. I might be a little bit biased also because the money will go in here and my opponent ends up showing down with 7-5, which he openly shows after losing the hand on the river 9. So I make a flush, taking down this over $2,500 pot, or €2,500 pot, actually, I must say. But he shows 7-5, and apparently he was checking the flop in order to check raise, which I think is a great play, to be honest. Like, I think he did play the hand really well. If I look at the equities for a spot like this, and I would give my opponent only like aces with the straight and aces with the nut flush draw and, for example, a king. Like, I'm looking down at 40% equity only, and on the turn at SPR4, a little bit less, I need at least 44% equity to stack off profitably. On top of that, not having that much fold equity, I think calling might actually be better. But, which my gut feeling was telling me in the moment was like, if my opponent would pot, for example, on the turn with aces and a nut flush draw and a king, like, I'm doing really well and I want to get the money in, of course. So it goes two directions, I would say. Anyway, very lucky winning this pot against his hand. I was only looking down at 25% equity, so not that much. And yeah, we're taking down this pot. Not very long after this hand, guys, the table unfortunately broke, and it was the end of a session, winning roughly 4,000 euros throughout the session. Great result, super happy with it, and I'm already looking forward to the next session that I'm gonna play here in the casino. So guys, thank you very much for tuning in. Appreciate it. Give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. That being said, over and out, and I will catch you guys in the next one.